Hey guys, welcome back. Before we start tonight, if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. It really does help this little channel grow, and I read every single one of them. Okay. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop. Tonight we're going somewhere cold, somewhere far away in time, but I promise, you'll be warm the whole way through. Let's begin. It is the winter of 1200 and something, in a place history barely bothered to name. A valley, maybe. A frozen riverbank, maybe. The kind of location that only matters because an army decided to stop there for the night. Snow has been falling since noon, quiet and steady, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates, softening every hard edge of the world until the tents look like something out of a dream, pale shapes scattered across white ground, smoke rising thin and gray from a few struggling fires. Inside one of those tents, a young soldier lies on his side, knees drawn up toward his chest, listening to the wind test the seams of the canvas above him. He is 19. He has been marching for 6 days. His toes have gone from aching to burning to a strange, distant numbness that frightens him more than the burning did, though he hasn't told anyone that. Beside him, another man breathes slow and even. Already asleep, or pretending to be, his cloak pulled up over his ears. Somewhere outside, a horse shifts its weight and exhales a long cloud of vapor into the dark. This is not the version of medieval warfare you usually hear about. No clashing swords tonight. No banners snapping in a heroic wind. Just cold, patient and enormous, pressing down on several hundred exhausted men who have to find a way to survive until morning without losing fingers, without losing toes, without simply not waking up. We tend to imagine medieval soldiers as figures of iron and spectacle, and in daylight, marching or fighting, maybe they were. But strip away the armor and the banners, and what remains, most nights, is something far more ordinary and far more human. Men trying to stay warm. Men counting the hours until dawn. Men who understood, in a way most of us never will. That surviving winter took as much courage as surviving a battle. It just asked for a quieter kind of endurance. Winter campaigns were common across medieval Europe, more common than people assume today. Sieges didn't pause for snow. Borders didn't stop needing defending because the ground had frozen solid. Armies moved through November, through December, sometimes further, and when they did, the men inside them had to solve a problem that had nothing to do with strategy or steel. They had to figure out how not to freeze. There was no single answer. There were dozens of small ones, stitched together night after night. Wool, laid carefully. Bodies, arranged deliberately. Fires, lit and hidden and rationed like gold. Animals, slept beside for the warmth they carried in their hides. None of it was glamorous. None of it made it into the songs written later about these campaigns. But it was the difference, for thousands of ordinary men, between seeing spring and not. Over the nights ahead, we're going to step quietly into those winter camps. We'll watch how tents were built to hold back frost that always found a way in anyway. We'll see how soldiers arranged themselves shoulder to shoulder for warmth they couldn't get any other way. We'll learn why a fire, that most basic comfort, could just as easily get a man killed as keep him alive. But for now, just picture the valley. The snow, still falling. The tents, breathing faint smoke into a darkening sky. And somewhere among them, a young soldier, finally drifting towards sleep, unaware that tonight is only the beginning of a winter that will test him in ways no battle ever could. Rest now. There's more to come. The snow has not stopped. By the second night, it has stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like something with intention, something patient, testing every gap in every tent, every loose lace on every boot, every place where wool has worn thin. The camp sprawls across the valley floor in loose, uneven rows, shaped less by military precision than by simple exhaustion, men pitching their tents wherever the ground allowed, wherever the wind seemed, for a moment, to relent. From a distance, it might look almost peaceful. Snow softens everything it touches, and a sleeping army under moonlight has a strange, hushed beauty to it, pale mounds of canvas, dark seams of footpaths worn between them. The occasional shape of a sentry standing motionless against the white. But peace was never really the word for it. This was a siege, though not the kind fought with catapults and battering rams. This was cold laying siege to flesh itself, probing for weakness the way any patient enemy does. Inside the command tent, an older captain sits wrapped in 3 layers of wool, studying a map he already knows by heart, less because he needs to and more because his hands need something to do besides shake. He has fought summer campaigns and autumn campaigns, and he has learned, the hard way, that winter asks something different of a man. Summer wears you down through heat and thirst and long exhausting marches. Winter works more quietly. It doesn't announce its damage. It simply arrives and waits, and by the time you notice, something has already been lost. A finger. A toe. Sometimes more. He glances toward the tent flap, where frost has already crept along the inner seam, delicate and lace-like, spreading further each hour. Outside, he can hear the low murmur of men trying to keep their voices down, trying to keep their fires small, trying to keep everything about their presence here as quiet and contained as possible. Because in winter, even sound carries differently. It seems to travel further across snow-muffled air, revealing more than anyone would like. Elsewhere in the camp, 2 brothers share a single cloak between them, an arrangement neither would have accepted back home, back before this campaign taught them what dignity was worth sacrificing for warmth. They lie back to back, close enough to share body heat, each one silently grateful the other doesn't complain about it. Nearby, a boy barely old enough to carry a spear presses his hands between his thighs, trying to coax feeling back into fingers that went numb hours ago during his watch. No one taught him this. He simply learned it, the way everyone here learned everything this winter, through trial, through discomfort, through the slow accumulation of small, hard-won knowledge. What makes a winter camp so dangerous isn't any single threat. It's the accumulation. Cold alone can be endured, for a while. Hunger alone can be endured. Exhaustion, dampness, the ache of sleeping on frozen ground, each one, alone, is survivable. But stacked together, night after night, they begin to wear down even strong men, chipping away at judgment, at patience, at the small margin of safety that separates a hard winter from a fatal one. And so the camp settles into its uneasy rhythm, fires tended low, voices kept quiet, bodies pressed together for warmth that etiquette would never allow in any other season. Somewhere at the edge of the camp, a sentry paces a slow, careful line, stamping his feet not for alertness but simply to keep blood moving through them. He watches the tree line, dark and indistinct beyond the falling snow, and wonders, not for the first time tonight, whether the greater danger tonight comes from beyond those trees, or from the cold pressing in from every direction at once. The valley holds its breath. The snow keeps falling. And somewhere beneath all that quiet white, an entire army waits out a siege that no enemy commander ordered, one that cold itself has laid, patiently, without needing a single soldier of its own. Somewhere past midnight, the wind shifts, and for a moment the entire camp seems to lean into it, canvas walls bowing inward before straightening again with a sound like a held breath released. The captain has finally set his map aside. Sleep won't come easily tonight, so instead he lets his mind wander to the question that follows every winter campaign like a shadow: why here? Why now? Why not simply wait for spring, the way any reasonable person might assume an army would? The truth is less romantic than most explanations offered later, in halls warmed by real fires, by men who never had to sleep on frozen ground themselves. Wars did not pause politely for the seasons. A besieged town, cut off and starving, could not be left alone for 4 months simply because the weather turned difficult. Every week of delay was a week the defenders might be reinforced, resupplied, given time to repair their walls or rally more men to their cause. Winter, brutal as it was, often worked as a weapon in its own right, and a commander bold enough to keep pressing through it could turn nature itself into an ally against an enemy expecting a season of rest. There is a strange kind of logic hidden inside that cruelty. An army that could endure winter conditions gained an advantage precisely because so few could. A besieged garrison, watching enemy campfires still burning outside their walls in January, might feel their resolve crumble faster than any battering ram could manage. Fear, after all, works differently in the cold. It settles deeper. It makes men question whether spring will ever really come, whether relief is coming at all, or whether they are simply waiting out a slow, freezing death behind walls that no longer feel like protection. And so campaigns continued, grinding through frozen roads and half-frozen rivers, because stopping meant losing ground, literally and otherwise. Supply lines that had taken months to establish couldn't simply be abandoned for a season and expected to hold. Alliances, fragile even in good weather, could fracture if one side appeared too willing to retreat at the first hard frost. Reputation mattered as much as territory in these conflicts. A lord who marched his men home at the first snowfall risked being remembered and judged very differently than one who pressed forward, whatever the cost. Not every reason was strategic, either. Some campaigns dragged into winter simply because they had already gone on too long to stop cleanly. Sieges that should have ended by autumn but hadn't, armies too far from home to easily turn back, commanders trapped by decisions made months earlier under entirely different circumstances. War, once begun, rarely followed anyone's careful planning for very long. It developed its own momentum, indifferent to comfort, indifferent to the calendar. The captain has seen both kinds of winter campaigns in his years of service, the deliberate ones, chosen because someone calculated an advantage worth the suffering, and the accidental ones, stumbled into because retreat seemed, at the time, more dangerous than pressing forward. He has never been entirely sure which kind troubles him more. The deliberate campaigns, at least, come with a reason he can explain to frightened young soldiers on cold nights like this one. The accidental ones offer nothing but endurance for its own sake, suffering with no clear purpose beyond simply surviving long enough to see what happens next. He thinks, briefly, of the young soldier he passed earlier that evening. The one with numb toes he hadn't mentioned to anyone. 19 years old, pulled into a war that likely has very little to do with him personally, asked to endure a winter siege because larger forces, larger ambitions, decided the timing couldn't wait. It is, the captain thinks, one of the oldest and cruelest arrangements in warfare. Those with the least power over a war's timing are so often the ones asked to bear its harshest conditions. Outside, the wind settles again, and the fires burn low and careful, hidden as much as warmth allows. Whatever reasons brought this army to this valley in the dead of winter, those reasons matter little to the men trying simply to survive until dawn. Strategy explains why they are here. It does not make the cold any less real. By the third night, the young soldier has learned something about his tent that no one warned him of before this campaign began. Canvas is a lie. A comforting one, perhaps, the way a closed door feels safer than an open field, but a lie nonetheless. It keeps out the snow, mostly. It does very little against the cold itself, which seeps through the weave of the fabric as though the material barely exists at all, as though the only thing separating him from the open winter sky is a thin idea of shelter rather than the reality of it. He lies awake, watching his own breath rise and catch the faint moonlight filtering through a seam near the tent's peak, and he thinks about the men who designed these things. Generations ago, for campaigns fought mostly in spring and summer. Wool and linen, stretched over simple wooden frames, built to keep out rain and wind and prying eyes, never really built with January in mind. Someone, somewhere, decided long ago that this was sufficient shelter for an army, and no one since had thought to question it too seriously, because questioning it meant admitting there might not be a better answer. Tents varied, of course, depending on rank and resource. The captain's tent, larger and better provisioned, held a small brazier that could be tended through the night, its heat modest but real, enough to keep frost from forming on the inner walls the way it did everywhere else in camp. Most soldiers had no such luxury. They slept in canvas barely large enough to lie down in, sometimes shared between 4 or 5 men who had learned, through hard experience, that crowding together was warmer than the dignity of space. Frost formed anyway, regardless of rank, regardless of care. It crept along the inner seams first, delicate as lacework, spreading slowly across canvas that had gone damp from trapped breath and body heat with nowhere else to escape. By morning, that same moisture would sometimes freeze solid, turning tent walls stiff and brittle, crackling faintly when touched, shedding thin flakes of ice onto whoever brushed too close while dressing in the dark. The ground offered its own particular cruelty. Even with straw laid down as insulation, even with cloaks doubled beneath sleeping bodies, the frozen earth pulled warmth downward relentlessly, drawing heat from a sleeping man the way water draws heat from anything submerged in it. Soldiers learned to sleep curled tight, knees to chest, minimizing the surface area touching that hungry ground, though nothing fully solved the problem. Many woke throughout the night not from dreams but from the simple ache of cold seeping upward through their spines, forcing them to shift position, to press closer to whoever slept beside them, to steal what warmth they could from another body doing exactly the same thing. Some tents fared worse than others, depending entirely on chance, a poorly chosen pitch on lower ground where cold air pooled overnight, a seam sewn slightly looser than it should have been, a canvas grown thin and worn from too many previous campaigns. The soldiers who drew these unlucky tents learned quickly to trade favors, to negotiate their way into better shelter through small kindnesses offered to whoever controlled the more solid canvas, an extra ration shared, a watch shift covered, whatever currency existed in a camp where money meant far less than comfort. The young soldier's own tent, he has decided, sits somewhere in the middle, not the worst in camp, not nearly the best. He has stuffed the gap near his feet with spare cloth, has learned to angle his body away from the seam that catches the worst of the wind, has made his own small peace with a shelter that will never truly be warm, only slightly less cold than the world outside it, he closes his eyes again, listening to the canvas shift and settle around him like something almost alive, straining gently against ropes and stakes that hold it fixed against a wind determined to find its way through regardless. Somewhere nearby, another soldier coughs quietly into the dark, and someone else murmurs something too soft to make out, and the tent, imperfect as it is, holds them all together inside its thin, trembling walls, not warm, exactly, but shelter enough for one more night. There is a particular sound that settles over the camp once most of the fires have burned down to embers, the low, layered rhythm of dozens of men breathing in close quarters, a sound almost like the sea if you let yourself imagine it that way, rising and falling in overlapping waves from tent to tent. The young soldier has grown used to it now, this third night of the campaign, though on the first night it had struck him as strange, almost unsettling, to sleep so tightly pressed against men he'd known only weeks. Back home, sleep had been a private thing. A narrow bed, a door that closed, the simple luxury of space around his own body that he'd never once thought to be grateful for until it disappeared entirely. Here, in this valley, privacy had become a currency no one could afford. Soldiers slept in ranks, quite literally, arranged shoulder to shoulder along the length of each tent the way they might stand shoulder to shoulder on a battlefield. Discipline extending even into unconsciousness, it wasn't sentiment that arranged them this way. It was arithmetic, cold and simple. A single body loses heat quickly to open air, but two bodies pressed together lose heat far more slowly, and three or four arranged carefully lose it slower still, each man's warmth becoming, in some small way, shared property among the group. Someone, generations back, had worked this out through nothing more sophisticated than trial and freezing error. And the lesson had passed down through armies the way so much practical knowledge does, not written in any manual, just carried forward, soldier to soldier, winter to winter. The arrangement required a kind of trust that peacetime never demanded. A man had to sleep back to back with someone whose habits he barely knew, tolerate an elbow finding his ribs in the dark, accept the particular indignity of waking tangled with a stranger's cloak, a stranger's cold feet pressed against his calves. Rank helped little here. A knight might find himself sleeping beside a common footman purely because the tent assignment made no distinctions once the fires died down and the cold made its demands known to everyone equally. Some men managed this closeness better than others. The two brothers, still sharing their single cloak between them, had at least the comfort of familiar warmth, though even they occasionally muttered complaints too tired to carry any real irritation. Elsewhere, less fortunate pairings tested patience nightly. A soldier prone to restless sleep kept an entire tent shifting and grumbling through the darkest hours, while another, older man had earned a quiet reputation for lying perfectly still all night, a trait that had made him, without any effort on his part, one of the most sought-after tent partners in the entire camp. There was something almost tender in it, this forced intimacy stripped of all the usual social hesitations. Men who might never have spoken a personal word to each other in daylight found themselves, by necessity, learning the small details of each other's bodies in the dark, whose breathing grew ragged before sleep finally claimed them, whose old injury ached worse in cold weather and required a careful arrangement of blankets around a particular knee or shoulder. It became its own quiet language, unspoken but understood, the shifting and adjusting that happened wordlessly throughout the night as one man's need for warmth accommodated another's. The young soldier had drawn a spot this week between the older, still sleeping man and a wiry archer who talked in his sleep, low mumbled fragments of sentences that meant nothing to anyone but seemed, somehow, comforting rather than disturbing, proof, perhaps, that even in this cold, this exhaustion, some part of the mind still wandered somewhere gentler. He found himself listening to those fragments some nights instead of counting the hours until his watch, letting the soft, meaningless words become something almost like a lullaby. Tonight, he shifts slightly closer to the older man's back, careful not to wake him, chasing the faint warmth radiating there the way one might lean toward the last light of a dying fire. Outside, the wind continues its patient work against the tent walls. But inside, arranged in careful, practiced closeness, the small rank of sleeping men holds its ground against the cold, one borrowed degree of warmth at a time. Before sleep comes, there is always the ritual of dressing for it, and by now the young soldier has learned that surviving a winter night depends as much on what happens in the 10 minutes before he lies down as it does on anything after. Undressing, in the way he once understood it, no longer applies. Winter campaigns taught a different lesson entirely, that the line between what a man wears by day and what he wears to sleep had all but disappeared, dissolved by necessity into one continuous, layered armor against the cold. He unbuckles only what he must. The heavier plates, where he has them, come off and rest within reach, propped against the tent pole like a second sleeping companion, ready to be pulled back on at the first alarm. But the padding beneath, the thick quilted layer that cushions armor against skin, that stays. So does the wool tunic beneath that, and the extra shirt beneath that, until what remains is less a man undressing for rest and more a man simply removing the outermost, least necessary layer of a structure built specifically to keep him alive. Wool, he has come to understand, behaves differently than any other fabric he owned before this campaign. Even damp, even soaked through with the day's exertion or the faint moisture that seems to find its way into everything eventually, wool holds warmth in a way linen simply refuses to. An older soldier explained it to him once. Gruffly, without much patience for questions, gesturing at his own weathered cloak, good wool keeps working even wet, son, that's the whole point of it. Linen just gives up. The younger man hadn't fully believed it until he'd felt the difference himself, the way a damp wool cloak still radiated some stubborn warmth while a damp linen shirt turned instantly, miserably cold. Cloaks doubled as blankets, blankets doubled as extra layers, and everything a soldier owned that could possibly be worn eventually found its way onto his body by the coldest hours before dawn. Some men slept in their boots, unwilling to risk the vulnerability of bare feet against frozen ground even briefly, accepting the discomfort of stiff leather through the night as a fair trade against frostbite. Others removed their boots carefully, wrapping feet instead in dry wool socks kept specifically for sleeping, understanding that boots worn too long without relief invited their own particular damage, blisters that froze, leather that cracked, feet that never quite dried between one march and the next. Armor itself posed its own quiet dilemma each night. Metal, however finely made, holds cold the way nothing else does, turning brutally uncomfortable against skin within minutes of exposure to freezing air. Most soldiers removed the heaviest pieces entirely before sleep, accepting the risk of slower readiness against the certainty of misery, though a few, particularly those posted nearest the camp's exposed edges, kept essential pieces close enough to don in darkness without fumbling, muscle memory guiding hands that couldn't afford to hesitate if trouble came. The young soldier has developed his own careful sequence now, repeated nightly with the quiet devotion of a man who has learned exactly what keeps him alive. Cloak first, wrapped twice around his torso before he lies down. Then the second, thinner cloak layered over his legs specifically, tucked beneath him rather than simply draped, minimizing every possible gap where cold air might find its way in. His hands, he tucks beneath his own arms, pressed against the warmth of his ribs, a position that leaves him feeling strangely vulnerable, unable to reach quickly for a weapon should the need arise, though exhaustion has taught him to accept that particular risk in exchange for feeling in his fingers by morning. He thinks sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep finally takes him, of how strange this all would look to someone from home, a soldier of the realm, dressed not for battle but for survival against an enemy that carries no banner and shows no mercy regardless of which side a man fights for. There is no glory in wool cloaks doubled for warmth, no story worth telling around a fire afterward. And yet it is this quiet, unglamorous ritual, repeated correctly night after night, that has kept him alive this far into the campaign, layer by careful layer, holding back a cold that never stops testing for the smallest gap. Fire, in this camp, has become a strange kind of contradiction. The very thing every man craves most on a night like this, the thing that could ease the ache in frozen fingers, dry a damp cloak, offer some small comfort against the relentless cold, is also the thing that could end everything before dawn if handled carelessly. A fire large enough to warm a man is a fire visible from a ridge 2 miles distant. A fire bright enough to comfort is a fire bright enough to betray. The captain understood this calculus long before tonight, has understood it through a dozen winter campaigns stretching back further than he cares to count some evenings. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line the young sentry watched so carefully earlier, an enemy scout might be doing exactly what this camp's own scouts do on other nights, counting fires, estimating numbers, calculating exactly how many men warm themselves by how many flames, and reporting back with information that could shape tomorrow's battle before a single sword is drawn, so the fires stay small. Deliberately, painfully small. Where a man's instinct screams for more fuel, more flame, more of that dancing orange light that seems to promise real warmth, discipline insists on restraint instead. Fires are kept low and contained, dug sometimes into shallow pits that hide their glow from anyone viewing the camp from a distance, the flames themselves barely rising above the rim of earth surrounding them. It is warmth rationed like everything else this winter, enough to keep frostbite at bay, never enough to feel like comfort in any real sense. Smoke presents its own quiet betrayal. Even a fire hidden carefully from direct sight still breathes upward, a thin grey column rising into still winter air, visible for miles under the right conditions, especially at dawn when the light catches it just so against a pale sky. Experienced soldiers have learned to read the wind before deciding where to light even the smallest fire, understanding that a breeze carrying smoke toward enemy lines does more damage than any scout ever could, revealing not just a location but a scale, a shape, the entire outline of an army trying desperately to remain unseen. Tonight, the fires burn especially low, tucked into hollows and behind whatever natural cover the terrain offers. A fallen log here, a shallow rise in the ground there, anything that might break the sight line from the distant ridge where shadows move that could be trees swaying in wind, or could be something else entirely. No one says this fear aloud. It doesn't need saying. Every soldier huddled near these carefully diminished flames understands the arithmetic without anyone explaining it twice. The sentries feel this tension most acutely, positioned as they are at the camp's exposed edges, forbidden even the meager comfort of a nearby fire lest their silhouette against firelight offer an easy target for anyone watching from beyond. They stand instead in near total darkness, eyes adjusting slowly to shapes and shadows. Relying on sound and instinct rather than sight, stamping feet quietly to keep blood moving without the luxury of flame to warm them properly. It is, perhaps, the coldest post in the entire camp, made colder still by the psychological weight of standing guard against a threat that might announce itself from any direction, at any moment, without warning. The young soldier, off duty tonight, finds himself thinking about the sentries as he settles into his tent, grateful in a way he rarely voices for the rotation that spared him this particular watch tonight. He has stood that post before, knows intimately the particular loneliness of it, the way cold feels sharper somehow when there's no fire nearby to remind you that warmth still exists somewhere in the world. He wonders, not for the first time, whether the men on watch tonight are thinking about fires the way he sometimes does on his own restless nights, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of respectful caution, understanding that even something as simple and ancient as flame carries its own particular danger out here, where survival depends as much on remaining hidden as it does on staying warm. Somewhere at the camp's edge, a sentry's shadow shifts almost imperceptibly against the tree line, and the small, careful fires continue their quiet work, giving just enough warmth to matter, never enough to be seen. There is a particular hour, somewhere between the deepest part of night and the first faint suggestion of dawn, when the cold seems to reach its cruelest point, and it is almost always during this hour that a sentry's watch feels longest. The young soldier knows this hour well, has stood through it more times than he cares to remember, and tonight, watching the shape of another man pace the same slow line at the camp's edge, he feels something close to sympathy pass through him. Quiet and wordless, the sentry on duty tonight is older, a quiet man named Osric who rarely speaks more than necessary, who has earned, through some combination of steadiness and endurance, a reputation as one of the more reliable men to stand watch on the hardest nights. He paces now along a narrow strip of trampled snow, boots crunching softly with each measured step, arms crossed tight against his chest in a posture that has become less about alertness and more about simple survival, a way of holding what little warmth remains in his body close against itself. Time moves strangely during watch, he has learned over years of service. In daylight, an hour passes easily enough, filled with tasks and conversation and the simple business of living. But alone, in darkness, in cold sharp enough to make thinking itself feel sluggish, an hour stretches into something that feels considerably longer, each minute measured out in the growing numbness of fingers and toes. In the small rituals a man develops to mark time when he has no other way to track it. Osric counts his own breath sometimes, has learned that 100 slow exhales roughly marks a quarter hour, though he has never told anyone this, aware of how strange it might sound spoken aloud. The isolation weighs differently than the cold itself. Inside the tents, men sleep pressed together, sharing warmth, sharing the simple comfort of not being entirely alone with their thoughts. Out here, at the edge of everything, a sentry stands apart by necessity, eye scanning a darkness that offers little to actually see, ears straining for sounds that might mean nothing or might mean everything. It is a peculiar kind of loneliness, made sharper by exhaustion, by cold, by the particular vulnerability of standing guard over men who trust him completely to notice danger before it arrives. Osric has learned to manage the isolation the way he manages the cold, through small, deliberate habits that keep his mind from wandering into unhelpful places. He recites, silently, the names of villages along the route home, an old habit picked up years ago from another sentry, now long retired, who taught him that a wandering mind on watch was more dangerous than an idle one. He counts stars when the sky allows it, though tonight clouds hang low and heavy, offering nothing but uniform gray darkness pressing down against the camp. The physical toll compounds slowly, insidiously. His face has gone numb along one side, the side facing the wind, though he has learned to interpret this now not as alarm but as simply the price of this particular post, a discomfort to endure rather than fear, so long as feeling returns once his watch ends and warmth becomes available again. His feet ache in that familiar, deep way that has become almost routine this campaign, though tonight the ache carries a slightly sharper edge, cold enough that he shifts his weight more frequently than usual, stamping quietly to keep circulation moving through toes that feel increasingly distant from the rest of him. What sustains men like Osric through hours like this isn't bravery exactly, or at least not the kind celebrated in songs and stories told after victories. It is something quieter, more stubborn, a simple commitment to the men sleeping behind him, an understanding that his discomfort tonight, however severe, protects something larger than himself. He thinks sometimes, during these longest hours, of his own sons back home, imagines them sleeping warm and safe, and finds in that image a strange comfort, a reminder of exactly why this particular misery matters, why someone must stand here, cold and alone, so that others might rest without fear. Eventually, mercifully, the eastern sky begins its slow transformation. Darkness softening by degrees into something almost imperceptibly lighter, grey giving way, eventually, to the faintest suggestion of approaching dawn. Osric feels it before he consciously registers it, some old instinct recognizing the shift in the air itself, the promise, finally, that his watch is nearing its end, that somewhere behind him, his own tent and his own borrowed warmth are waiting, patient, for his return. Morning arrives slowly, reluctantly, the kind of grey winter dawn that seems to negotiate with darkness rather than simply replace it. The camp stirs in stages, first the sentries, relieved from their posts, stumbling toward whatever warmth their tents still hold. Then the cooks, coaxing low fires back to something useful. Then, gradually, everyone else, emerging from canvas shelters with the particular stiffness of men who have spent another night fighting a battle that leaves no visible wounds, at least not the kind anyone notices right away. It is during this quiet morning ritual that frostbite reveals itself, not through drama or crisis, but through small, almost mundane discoveries. A soldier pulling off his boots to check his feet, a habit drilled into every man on this campaign whether he wanted the habit or not, finds two toes gone an unsettling shade of white, hard to the touch, strangely absent of the pain he expects. Another man, unwrapping his hands from where they'd been tucked beneath his cloak all night, notices his smallest finger has taken on the same waxen pallor, numb in a way that feels different from ordinary cold, more absolute somehow. This is the particular cruelty of frostbite. It arrives without announcement, without the sharp warning pain a man might expect from an injury this serious. The nerve endings, damaged by cold, simply stop reporting accurately, leaving a soldier unaware that real harm has occurred until someone else notices the telltale pallor, or until the tissue begins to thaw and the pain arrives all at once, delayed and disproportionate to whatever warning should have come earlier. The older soldiers know to check constantly, have learned through hard experience or through watching others learn the hard way that vigilance here matters more than almost anything else. They check their own feet nightly, check their companions' hands and faces during the day, watching for that particular waxy whiteness, that slight stiffness that signals tissue beginning to freeze from the outside in. It has become as routine as checking a sword for rust, though considerably more urgent, since a rusted blade merely underperforms, while frostbitten flesh, left unchecked, can mean losing fingers, losing toes, sometimes losing far more. Osric, still recovering warmth from his long watch the night before, moves through the camp checking on younger soldiers with the quiet authority of someone who has seen frostbite claim men before, has watched the slow, terrible progression from numbness to blackened tissue to the eventual, often necessary amputation that follows when infection sets in. He has developed an eye for the early signs, catches a young archer's hand this morning before the man himself notices anything wrong, guides him firmly toward the nearest fire, instructs him on the careful, gradual warming that prevents further damage, the specific danger of warming frozen flesh too quickly against direct heat. The treatment itself demands patience most soldiers find difficult to summon after a long, cold night. Frozen fingers cannot simply be thrust toward a fire, however tempting that immediate relief might seem. Rapid warming against direct heat risks worse damage than the cold itself, burns compounding frostbite in ways that can cost a man his hand entirely rather than just the numbness he started with. Instead, the affected soldier must warm gradually, often tucking frozen fingers beneath his own arms or against another man's warm skin, enduring the strange, sharp pain that arrives as sensation slowly, painfully returns, a pain some men describe as worse than the original cold itself. The young soldier watches this morning ritual with a particular attentiveness now, having learned enough this campaign to understand exactly what's at stake. He checks his own feet carefully, relieved to find them merely aching rather than truly damaged, though he notices, with a small flicker of concern, that his littlest toe on his left foot has taken on a faint paleness he doesn't entirely trust. He mentions it to Osric, who examines it briefly, pronounces it early enough to reverse with careful attention, and instructs him firmly on what to watch for over the coming days. There is no glory in frostbite, no story worth telling later beyond a grim accounting of fingers and toes lost or saved through careful vigilance. It moves silently through camp, this particular enemy, claiming pieces of men who never heard it approach, revealing itself only in quiet morning moments like this one, when boots come off and cloaks unwrap and soldiers discover, with the same flat surprise every time, exactly what the night has cost them. By midday, word has spread quietly through camp the way bad news always seems to travel faster than good, passed between soldiers stacking wood, murmured among cooks stirring thin pots of grain. The supply wagons expected 3 days ago have not arrived. Whether delayed by snow-blocked roads, ambushed along some vulnerable stretch, or simply lost in the vast indifferent whiteness that has swallowed so much of this winter's certainty, no one can say for sure. What matters, practically, is that the fuel meant to see this camp through another week has not come, and what remains must now be measured with considerably more care than anyone had planned for. The quartermaster, a lean, humorless man named Aldrich, spends the afternoon moving methodically from woodpile to woodpile, counting, calculating, his expression growing steadily grimmer with each tally. He has done this arithmetic before, on other campaigns, in other winters, and he already knows, before he finishes counting, roughly what the answer will be. Not enough. Never quite enough. When supply lines fail this deep into hostile territory, this far from anywhere reliable, the decision, when it comes, arrives without ceremony, delivered simply through Aldrich moving from tent to tent, informing small clusters of soldiers of the new arrangement. Fires, from tonight forward, will burn only during the coldest hours, lit later and extinguished earlier than the camp has grown accustomed to. Cooking fires will serve double duty, warming hands during the brief windows they burn rather than staying lit purely for comfort afterward. Wood-gathering parties, previously a task assigned somewhat casually to whoever had free hands, now becomes a formal, daily duty, soldiers sent out in careful groups to strip whatever fuel the surrounding frozen landscape might still offer. This last task proves harder than anyone anticipated. The nearby forest, generous enough in the campaign's earlier days, has already been picked over considerably, deadfall and fallen branches collected and burned through weeks of previous nights. What remains requires more effort to find, more distance to travel, more risk in venturing further from the camp's relative safety into terrain that might hide anything from wolves to enemy scouts among its shadowed tree line. The young soldier finds himself assigned to one such gathering party this afternoon, trudging through knee-deep snow alongside for others, axes and ropes slung over their shoulders, breath forming small clouds that hang briefly in the still, cold air before dissipating. They work mostly in silence, conserving energy, each man focused on the immediate task of locating anything burnable, a fallen branch here, a dead standing tree there, worth the effort of felling despite the additional labor it demands from bodies already exhausted by cold and insufficient food. There is something almost meditative in the work, despite its grimness. A rhythm that settles into muscle and breath once the initial reluctance passes. Swing, pause, assess. Drag the gathered wood back toward a central point where it can be bundled and carried together. The cold, paradoxically, becomes almost bearable during the labor itself, exertion generating its own temporary warmth that the men know will fade quickly once they stop moving. Once sweat cools against skin in a way that carries its own particular danger. By the time they return to camp, dusk settling fast and blue-gray across the valley, the gathered wood amounts to considerably less than anyone hoped, spread thin across a woodpile that still looks worryingly modest against the nights ahead. Aldrich surveys it with the same grim expression he's worn all day, makes a final calculation, and announces the ration for the evening: smaller fires, fewer of them, spaced further apart, with priority given to the sick and the sentries whose exposure demands whatever warmth can still be spared. The young soldier settles into his tent that night with a chill that feels different from previous nights, sharper somehow, aware now of exactly how thin the margin has become between comfort and real danger. He thinks of Aldrich's careful counting, of the wood-gathering party's meager harvest, of how quickly an army's survival can hinge on something as ordinary and unglamorous as supply wagons delayed on some unknown stretch of frozen road, and he understands, more clearly than he has all campaign, exactly how fragile this entire fragile arrangement of survival really is. Beyond the tents, at the camp's edge where the ground slopes gently toward what was once a stream before ice claimed it entirely, the horses stand together in a loose, patient cluster, their breath rising in slow, rhythmic clouds against the darkening sky. The young soldier has been assigned stable duty tonight, a task he's come to view with less dread than he once did, having learned over these past weeks that the animals offer something the men's own camp rarely can, a warmth that asks nothing in return beyond simple proximity. Horses, he has discovered, understand winter in ways that seem almost instinctive, arranging themselves without any human direction into configurations that conserve heat with an efficiency no soldier could have designed better through deliberate planning. They stand flank to flank, heads lowered, tails turned against the wind, each animal's body heat contributing to a shared warmth that radiates gently through the small cluster. It is, he thinks, watching them settle into their nightly arrangement, not so different from what the soldiers do in their own tents, though the horses seem to manage it with considerably less complaint. The larger animals matter enormously to a winter campaign, and not merely for warmth, though that benefit hardly goes unnoticed by soldiers assigned to sleep near the stable lines on the coldest nights. A horse's body, generating heat through its sheer size and constant metabolic effort, can warm a surrounding space in ways a small fire never quite manages, without the danger of smoke or visible flame giving away a position. Soldiers have learned this, have taken to bedding down near the horse lines on nights when the cold feels particularly severe, accepting the smell and occasional restless shifting of the animals as fair trade for the steady warmth their bodies provide. Tonight, the young soldier checks each horse carefully, running experienced hands along legs and hooves, watching for the telltale signs of trouble that cold brings even to animals bred for endurance. Frozen ground poses its own dangers to horses, ice forming in hoof cracks, joint stiffening in ways that could cripple an animal if not managed carefully. He has learned to keep the horses moving periodically through the day, understanding now what he didn't fully grasp weeks ago, that stillness, however tempting in this cold, poses its own particular risks to creature and rider alike. The animals require fuel too, in their own way, hay and grain rationed now with the same careful calculation Aldrich applies to firewood. Supply shortages touching every corner of camp equally. A hungry horse in winter loses condition rapidly, and a weakened horse becomes a liability rather than an asset, unable to carry a rider's weight through deep snow, unable to pull supply carts when the roads finally clear enough to travel. The young soldier has watched the stable master divide the dwindling grain with visible reluctance, understanding the mathematics of scarcity as well as anyone in camp, weighing tonight's ration against tomorrow's uncertain resupply. There is companionship in this work too, something the young soldier hadn't expected when first assigned to stable duty weeks ago. The horses, for all their size and strength, seem to appreciate quiet company on nights like this, leaning gently into a familiar hand, exhaling long, warm breaths against his cold fingers when he checks their muzzles for ice. He has grown fond of one horse particularly, a sturdy grey gelding belonging to one of the older knights, an animal with a calm, steady temperament that seems entirely unbothered by the chaos and hardship surrounding it, content simply to stand close and share whatever warmth the moment offers. Other animals move through camp too, though with less ceremony than the horses. A few hunting dogs kept for scouting and occasional game, curled tight into balls near whatever fire remains lit, and even the camp's small collection of mules, hardier in some ways than the horses, less bothered by cold but equally grateful for the shared warmth of the herd. Each animal, in its own way, has found its particular strategy for surviving this brutal season, strategies that often mirror, in unexpected ways, the strategies the soldiers themselves have adopted, huddling together, conserving energy, accepting discomfort as the ordinary cost of endurance. As the young soldier finishes his rounds, he lingers a moment longer near the grey gelding, resting his palm against the animal's warm neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath thick winter coat. There is something quietly comforting in this simple contact, a reminder that survival through this brutal season depends not only on human ingenuity and discipline, but on these patient, uncomplaining creatures who share the burden of winter alongside the men who depend on them, offering warmth and steadiness in equal measure, asking for nothing more than careful hands and whatever grain the dwindling stores can still provide. There is a soldier named Watt, quartered 3 tents down from the young soldier who twisted his ankle 2 days ago on a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow, a small misfortune that in warmer months might have meant nothing more than a day's discomfort and a limp soon forgotten. Here, in this particular winter, in this particular camp, it has become something the surgeon watches with far more concern than the injury itself would seem to warrant, and tonight the young soldier finds himself thinking about why, understanding a little more each day about how thoroughly cold changes the calculations of survival. The surgeon, an aging man named the Bow who has followed enough campaigns to have opinions about most things, explained it once to a gathering of curious soldiers around a rationed fire. Wounds that would heal cleanly enough in summer become something far more dangerous in winter, not because the injury itself changes, but because everything surrounding it does. Blood flow slows in cold limbs, carrying fewer of the resources a healing body needs. Circulation, already compromised by hours spent standing watch or sleeping curled against frozen ground, struggles further when asked to also repair damaged tissue. What might close and mend in a week under normal conditions can instead linger, fester, turn into something considerably worse. Watt's ankle, swollen and discolored, has not improved as quickly as the bow would like, and today the surgeon spent a long, careful hour examining it by lamplight, pressing gently along the swollen tissue, watching Watt's face for the particular wince that would signal infection setting in beneath the surface. The verdict, delivered with the careful, measured tone the bow reserves for uncertain news, offered no immediate alarm but no real comfort either. Watch it closely, keep it warm and elevated when possible, though elevated in a cold camp offers little of the benefit it might provide somewhere warmer, somewhere the blood could actually circulate properly to speed the healing. This is the particular cruelty laid atop every injury this winter, the young soldier has come to understand. A cut that would simply scab over in autumn instead stays raw longer in cold air, reluctant to close, vulnerable to infection in ways that summer wounds rarely face. A sprained joint that would loosen and heal with gentle daily movement instead stiffens further overnight, frozen muscles refusing the small exercises that might otherwise speed recovery. Even minor injuries, ones that any soldier would shrug off without concern in a different season, carry a heavier weight here, compounded by cold that seems determined to make healing as difficult as possible. The bow has seen worse than Watt's ankle over the years, has watched infections take hold in cold-slowed wounds and spread with a speed that would shock anyone unfamiliar with winter campaigns, turning a soldier from merely injured to gravely ill within days rather than the weeks such progression might take in warmer conditions. He keeps a careful eye now on every reported injury in camp, however minor it initially appears, understanding that this particular season shows no mercy toward wounds left unwatched, that vigilance here matters as much as any medicine he carries in his modest supply of herbs and bandages. The young soldier visits Watt that evening, finds him propped against a rolled cloak inside his tent, ankle-wrapped and elevated on a makeshift bundle of spare clothing, expression somewhere between boredom and quiet worry. They talk for a while about nothing important, the easy, meandering conversation of men passing time, though the young soldier notices Watt glancing occasionally toward his wrapped ankle with an expression that suggests he understands, on some level, exactly how precarious his situation has become, how a simple misstep on hidden ice could, in this particular winter, in this particular camp, mean something far more serious than a temporary inconvenience. Before leaving, the young soldier helps arrange an extra cloak around Watt's shoulders, a small kindness that costs him little but seems to matter considerably to a man confined to stillness in weather that punishes stillness above almost everything else. Watt thanks him quietly, and the young soldier makes his way back toward his own tent through the darkening camp, thinking about how thin the margin has become between minor misfortune and genuine danger, how a season this harsh seems determined to punish even the smallest mistakes with consequences far beyond what they would carry in gentler weather. Word reaches the young soldier the following morning, passed quietly between tents the way most significant news travels in camp, that Aldrich's fuel calculations have forced a decision higher up the chain than any quartermaster's authority alone can settle. The captain has been summoned to a meeting with the campaign's overall commander, a stern, weathered lord named Sir Reynold, whose reputation for pragmatic, sometimes ruthless decision-making precedes him through every rank of the army. The meeting itself happens inside Renault's tent, larger and better appointed than most, though even here the cold intrudes, visible in the faint clouds of breath that hang between the assembled officers as they discuss options that all carry some measure of risk. The young soldier learns of what transpires there only second-hand, through the captain's terse account delivered to his own officers later that afternoon, though the substance of the decision spreads through camp regardless, carried on the particular anxious energy that accompanies new soldiers know will affect them directly. Rationed, it seems, has decided against retreat, against the safer, more conservative option of falling back toward better supplied territory where fuel and food might be secured more reliably. Retreat means abandoning ground gained through weeks of difficult campaigning, means potentially losing the strategic advantage this winter siege was meant to secure in the first place. Instead, he has ordered the camp to press forward with reduced rations across the board, fuel and food both stretched thinner than comfort allows, gambling that reinforcement and resupply will arrive before the shortage becomes truly dangerous. It is, the captain explains later, the kind of decision that separates commanders remembered for boldness from those remembered for caution, though which reputation proves more accurate often depends entirely on outcomes no one can predict in advance. A commander who presses forward and succeeds becomes celebrated for decisive leadership, willing to accept hardship in service of victory. The same decision, ending badly, becomes instead a cautionary tale, evidence of recklessness that cost men their fingers, their toes, sometimes their lives, in service of ambition that outpaced practical resources. The young soldier turns this over in his mind that evening, sitting near one of the camp's smaller, more carefully rationed fires, listening to older soldiers discuss the decision with the particular weary resignation of men who have lived through such calculations before. Some voice quiet frustration, the low grumbling of soldiers who feel, not unreasonably, that their own comfort and safety have been weighed against strategic advantage and found less valuable than continuing the campaign. Others, more experienced perhaps, or simply more accustomed to accepting decisions beyond their control, shrug the matter off with the particular fatalism that seems to develop in men who have marched through enough winters to understand that complaint changes nothing. Osric, settling near the same fire, offers little commentary beyond a brief, measured observation that seems to carry the weight of considerable experience behind it. Commanders always weigh soldiers' comfort against larger goals, he says, not unkindly, simply stating what he clearly considers an unavoidable truth of military life. The question worth asking isn't whether such calculations happen, but whether the particular commander making them has good judgment, has proven trustworthy in previous decisions that balance similar risks against similar rewards. Rationed, he adds after a pause, has made difficult calls before that worked out favorably enough to earn a certain grudging trust, though trust earned through past success offers no guarantee against a single miscalculation proving catastrophic. The young soldier thinks about this as he settles into his tent later, wrapped in his careful arrangement of cloaks against a cold that feels, tonight, sharper somehow, colored by the knowledge that rations will grow thinner still in the coming days. He thinks of Watt's swollen ankle, of the sentries who will stand watch with less fire to return to afterward, of the horses whose grain allowance has already been reduced once and may face further cuts if resupply continues to falter. Each of these small hardships, he realizes, traces back eventually to decisions made in tents like Renault's, calculations weighing abstract strategic advantage against very concrete, very personal suffering experienced by men who have little say in how that balance gets struck. He does not resent the decision exactly, understanding on some level that campaigns require exactly this kind of difficult calculation, that no commander could satisfy every soldier's comfort while still achieving whatever larger purpose brought this army to this valley in the first place. But he understands now, more clearly than he did even a few days ago, exactly how much weight rests on judgment made by men he will likely never meet personally, men whose decisions shape, in very immediate and physical ways, whether he keeps all his fingers through this campaign, whether Watt's ankle heals properly, whether the horses survive strong enough to carry them home when spring finally, mercifully arrives. Dawn brings orders to break camp, the fourth such relocation since the campaign began, and the young soldier moves through the familiar motions of dismantling his tent with a weariness that feels, this morning, deeper than simple physical fatigue. There is a particular exhaustion that settles into a man after weeks of this, he has noticed, one that sleep alone doesn't seem to touch, a heaviness that lives somewhere behind the eyes rather than in the muscles. The march itself stretches ahead of them, another day of trudging through snow that varies between ankle-deep and knee-deep depending on the terrain. Following a route that Sir Renault's scouts have deemed necessary, though no one below the rank of captain seems entirely certain why. This particular path. This particular timing. The soldiers simply walk, one boot placed carefully after another, conversation dwindling as the morning wears on into something closer to silence, each man retreating into whatever private thoughts help the miles pass more tolerably. It is this silence, more than the cold itself, that Osric has learned to watch for carefully among the younger soldiers under his informal guidance. A man who talks too little, who stops responding to the small jokes and observations that usually pass between marching soldiers, has often begun a particular kind of retreat inward that experienced campaigners recognize as dangerous in its own quiet way. Not madness, exactly, nothing so dramatic as the stories sometimes told about winter campaigns driving men to violence or despair. Something smaller, more insidious, a gradual numbing, a withdrawal that makes a soldier less careful, less attentive to the small details that keep a man alive through conditions like these. The young soldier feels this himself today, walking beside a companion named Godric who has grown increasingly quiet over the past several days, responding to conversation with short, distracted answers that suggest his attention has wandered somewhere the young soldier cannot follow. Godric's eyes carry a particular flatness this morning, fixed somewhere in the middle distance rather than on the path ahead, and the young soldier finds himself watching his friend with growing concern, uncertain exactly how to address something he can sense but struggles to name precisely. This endless quality of winter campaigning wears differently than the sharper, more immediate fears of battle. A soldier can steel himself against the terror of combat, can summon courage for a discreet, bounded confrontation with a clear beginning and end. But this relentless accumulation of cold and hunger and exhaustion, day after indistinguishable day, offers no clear enemy to rally against, no single moment demanding courage so much as an endless, grinding demand for simple continuance. Keep walking. Keep enduring. Keep placing one foot before the other through snow that never seems to end, toward a destination that feels, some mornings, almost theoretical. Osric has seen this particular weariness claim men before, has watched soldiers who survived actual combat unscathed grow gradually hollow instead under the weight of prolonged hardship without any decisive resolution in sight. He makes a point today of walking near Godric for a stretch, not offering advice exactly, simply present, occasionally commenting on something small and concrete, the particular shape of a distant hill, the way certain trees seem to hold snow differently than others, small anchors to the immediate physical world that sometimes help pull a wandering mind back from wherever it has drifted. The young soldier watches this quiet intervention with growing understanding, recognizing in Osric's simple, patient presence something he hadn't previously appreciated about survival on campaigns like this one. It isn't only wool and fire and careful rationing that keeps men alive through a winter like this. It is also this attention paid to each other's quieter struggles, this willingness to notice when a companion's silence has shifted from ordinary tiredness into something requiring gentle intervention before it deepens further. By midday, something in Godric's expression has shifted slightly, whether from Osric's quiet company or simply the natural rhythm of a long march working its way through whatever weight had settled over him that morning. He speaks again, tentatively at first, responding to a small joke the young soldier offers about the state of his own frozen beard, and though the flatness hasn't entirely left his eyes, something has eased, some small tension released. The march continues, mile after grinding mile, but the three of them walk together now, present for each other in whatever small way this endless winter allows, understanding without needing to say it aloud that this particular kind of company matters as much as any fire or cloak in surviving what remains of the campaign ahead. By late afternoon, the column crests a low ridge and the young soldier sees it before anyone announces it aloud, smoke rising thin and gray against the darkening sky ahead, marking a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. A village, small and unremarkable by any ordinary measure, the kind of place that would draw no attention at all in a different season, under different circumstances. Tonight, though, it draws every eye in the column, each soldier calculating the same simple, uncomfortable arithmetic: walls, roofs, shelter that doesn't require canvas and rope and hope against the wind. The captain confers briefly with Sir Renault's scouts, and word passes back through the ranks with a speed that suggests relief more than any particular satisfaction. The army will billet here tonight, spread among whatever structures the village offers, barns and storehouses and the modest homes of people who had no say whatsoever in this arrangement. The young soldier feels the conflicting pull of this news immediately, genuine, aching gratitude at the prospect of solid walls between himself and the wind, tangled uncomfortably with something closer to shame, an awareness of exactly what this billeting will cost the people who live here. He has thought little, until this moment, about the villages an army passes through during a winter campaign, has been too consumed with his own survival to consider carefully what his presence means for those unlucky enough to live along a chosen route. Now, walking down into the valley alongside hundreds of other soldiers, watching villagers emerge from their homes with expressions caught somewhere between resignation and barely suppressed fear, he begins to understand the weight of it more fully. The village headman, an older man with a weathered, careworn face that suggests he has navigated this exact situation before, meets the captain with the particular practiced diplomacy of someone who understands resistance serves no purpose against an army this size. There is no negotiation in any meaningful sense, only a kind of grim accounting: how many soldiers, how many buildings, how the burden might be distributed with whatever fairness remains possible when fairness was never really part of the equation to begin with. The young soldier finds himself billeted in a modest barn alongside 6 others, the structure's owner, a thin woman with 2 young children, watching from her nearby cottage with an expression he finds difficult to meet directly. He busies himself instead with the practical business of settling in, grateful despite himself for solid wooden walls that block wind far more effectively than canvas ever managed, for a roof that holds back snow entirely rather than merely slowing its accumulation. Osric, settling nearby with the particular weary pragmatism of a man who has billeted in dozens of villages across many campaigns, offers a quiet observation that the young soldier turns over carefully in his mind afterward. "This is simply how it works," he says, not unkindly, not without some evident discomfort of his own. An army moving through winter cannot carry enough shelter for every soldier, and villages, however unwilling, become part of the campaign's logistics whether anyone asked their permission or not. It doesn't make it right, Osric adds, after a pause, just makes it necessary, which are not, he notes quietly, always the same thing. That evening, the young soldier watches the village's modest stores of food dwindle visibly under the demands of feeding an army that has arrived, uninvited, expecting hospitality that borders on requisition. He watches the thin woman ration what remains of her own supplies more carefully than she likely would have needed to otherwise, watches her children regard the soldiers occupying their family's barn with wide, wary eyes that suggest they have learned already, at an age far too young, exactly what an army's passage costs the people unlucky enough to live in its path. He sleeps that night warmer than he has in days, wrapped in solid walls rather than trembling canvas, and finds the comfort somehow harder to fully accept than the cold ever was. Aware throughout the night of the quiet cost this shelter has extracted from people who had no soldiers of their own, no army to billet in return, nothing but the simple misfortune of living along a route some distant commander decided the campaign required. The cough starts small, easy to dismiss, a single soldier clearing his throat near the barn's entrance on the second morning in the village. By the third day, though, the young soldier has counted at least a dozen similar coughs echoing through the crowded shelters, a low chorus that seems to spread as steadily and inevitably as the cold itself, moving from man to man through the close, shared air of overcrowded barns and storehouses. The beau moves through the village with visible concern this morning, his usual measured calm edged with something sharper, more urgent. He has seen this pattern before, he explains to the captain within the young soldier's hearing, and it rarely announces itself gently. Whatever illness has taken hold, whether simple fever or something more serious, finds fertile ground in conditions like these. Men packed tightly together for warmth, breathing the same stale air night after night, immune systems already weakened by cold and insufficient food and the accumulated exhaustion of weeks without proper rest. The barn where the young soldier sleeps has become, without anyone quite deciding it deliberately, a small laboratory for exactly this kind of contagion. 6 men sharing close quarters, breath mingling in the confined space, the very closeness that offered such welcome warmth against the cold now revealing its darker side. Godric, still recovering from whatever weariness had claimed him during the march, develops a fever by the second night in the village, his forehead hot to the touch when the young soldier checks on him, his breathing shallow and labored in a way that worries everyone nearby. The beau attends to Godric personally, along with a growing list of similarly afflicted soldiers scattered through the village's makeshift shelters, his supply of herbs and remedies stretched now as thin as the fuel and food that concerned the camp just days earlier. He has little to offer beyond the basic comforts of warmth and rest, willow bark tea for fever, honey and warm broth when the village's dwindling stores can spare it, and the simple, unglamorous work of monitoring each patient carefully for the signs that separate ordinary illness from something more dangerous. The village headman, watching this unfolding situation with an expression that mixes genuine sympathy with barely concealed worry for his own people, raises a quiet concern to the captain that the young soldier overhears during a brief exchange near the barn. Whatever illness moves through the soldiers now risks moving next through the village itself, through children and elders who have no better defense against contagion than exhausted men sleeping in close quarters. The captain, to his credit, takes this concern seriously, orders what separation remains possible between the sickest soldiers and the village's own residents, though separation proves difficult in a settlement this small, this thoroughly occupied by an army seeking shelter from conditions that made the illnesses spread almost inevitable in the first place. The young soldier finds himself assigned, informally, to help tend Godric through the worst of his fever, sitting beside his friend through long stretches of the night, offering water when Godric's fever spikes, extra blankets when chills replace the heat, simple quiet company through hours when sleep proves impossible for either of them. He thinks, during these long vigils, about how thoroughly this campaign has taught him that danger rarely announces itself as dramatically as stories suggest. No enemy charge, no battlefield chaos. Just a cough, spreading quietly from man to man through crowded shelter, doing damage that might prove, in its own patient way, just as costly as any confrontation with an actual enemy. By the fourth night, Godric's fever breaks, gradually, leaving him weak but recognizably improving, color slowly returning to a face that had grown alarmingly pale through the worst of the illness. Not every soldier proves so fortunate. 2 others in a neighboring shelter develop symptoms serious enough that the beau moves them to a separate building entirely. His expression, when the young soldier passes him in the yard, carrying a weight that suggests concern deeper than he voices aloud to the soldiers still recovering nearby. The young soldier sits with Godric that final night of his fever, watching his friend finally sleep peacefully rather than fitfully, and finds himself thinking, not for the first time this campaign, about how many different, quiet dangers accumulate around an army moving through winter, cold and hunger, and now this illness moving invisibly through crowded shelter, claiming its own toll alongside everything else this season has already demanded from men who signed up, most of them, for battle rather than this particular, unglamorous kind of endurance. The army moves on from the village 6 days later, leaving behind a headman visibly relieved to see them go and a young soldier who finds himself unexpectedly grateful for the return to canvas and open sky, however much colder that return proves to be. There is something about the open camp, he realizes as they resettle into their familiar rhythm of tents and rationed fires, that feels more honest somehow than the quiet, uneasy hospitality of the village, a discomfort he had at least chosen rather than one extracted from people who never agreed to bear it. Tonight, 3 days back into open campaigning, brings a different kind of unease entirely. The sentry rotation has fallen short. 2 men laid low by the lingering illness that swept through the village barns, leaving gaps in the watch schedule that Osric fills grimly with whatever soldiers remain fit enough to stand the additional hours. The young soldier draws an unexpected second watch this way, exhausted already from his earlier shift, trudging back out to the camp's perimeter well past the hour he'd expected to finally sleep. It is during this second watch that he first notices the silence, wrong in a way he struggles initially to articulate even to himself. Camps at night carry their own particular soundscape, he has learned over these past weeks, the low murmur of men breathing in crowded tents, the occasional shift and settle of canvas in wind. The distant, patient sounds of horses standing together at the picket line. Tonight, something in that familiar texture has gone quiet in a way that raises the hair on his arms before his mind fully catches up to what's bothering him. He finds the source a few minutes into his rounds, at the northeastern edge of the perimeter where a sentry named Corbin should be standing his post. The spot stands empty, footprints in the snow suggesting Corbin paced here recently, circling in the small worn path sentries wear into position over hours of watch, but no Corbin, no answer when the young soldier calls out softly, careful not to raise alarm before understanding what he's actually facing. His heart begins working harder than the cold alone would explain, and he moves forward carefully, scanning the tree line beyond the perimeter with newly sharpened attention, remembering. Suddenly every warning Osric and the older soldiers have offered about exactly this kind of silence. This kind of absence where a reliable presence should be. He finds Corbin finally, slumped against the base of a tree perhaps 30 paces beyond his assigned post, and the young soldier's alarm spikes sharply before resolving, just as quickly, into something closer to relieved frustration. Corbin is alive, breathing, though barely conscious, having succumbed simply to exhaustion so severe that his body apparently gave out mid-watch, collapsing quietly rather than raising any alarm that might have brought help sooner. No enemy action here, no dramatic confrontation. just a man pushed past what his depleted body could sustain, felled by the accumulated weight of illness and cold and insufficient rest that has been grinding down this entire camp for weeks now. The young soldier half carries, half drags Corbin back toward the nearest fire, calling quietly for help that arrives quickly once other soldiers register the urgency in his voice. The beau attends to Corbin within minutes, his examination revealing nothing more sinister than severe exhaustion compounded by the early stages of the same illness that claimed Godric days earlier, a combination that proved, tonight, nearly disastrous in ways that had nothing to do with any enemy at all. Osric finds the young soldier afterward, sitting near the fire where Corbin now rests, wrapped in extra blankets and watched carefully by the beau's assistant. "There is a particular danger," Osric says quietly, settling beside him in a watch-falling silent, one that has nothing to do with enemies beyond the tree line. An entire camp depends on sentries remaining alert, remaining present, and when illness and exhaustion compromise that reliability, the danger becomes less about what might sneak past unnoticed and more about the sentries themselves, pushed past reasonable limits by a campaign that has already asked so much of bodies with precious little left to give. The young soldier nods slowly, understanding settling over him with the particular weight of lessons learned through near catastrophe rather than careful instruction. He thinks of Corbin's empty post, of the wrongness he'd felt before consciously identifying its cause, and resolves silently to trust that particular instinct more readily in whatever nights remain ahead, understanding now, more viscerally than any warning could have taught him, exactly how dangerous the silence of a fallen watch can become. Morning arrives grey and still after Corbin's collapse, the camp settling into its usual quiet rhythms of stirring fires and stiff limbs, though something in the air feels different today, a subdued watchfulness that wasn't quite present before last night. The young soldier moves through his morning routine with unusual attentiveness, checking his own feet and hands with the careful thoroughness Osric taught him weeks ago, aware now, in a way he hadn't fully absorbed until last night, exactly how thin the margin has grown between endurance and something considerably darker. It is the beau who delivers the morning's harder news, quietly, to the captain first and then, inevitably, filtering through camp the way all significant news eventually does. An older soldier named Fenwick, quartered near the camp's western edge, did not wake this morning. His tent mates, discovering this only when the general stirring of camp failed to rouse him, found him already gone, having simply not survived the night, his body finally succumbing to a combination the surgeon describes with careful, measured language: exhaustion, cold, and a heart that had, perhaps, been strained past what months of campaigning could sustain in a man of his years. There is no drama in how the beau describes it, no attempt to soften or dramatize what happened, simply the plain, quiet fact of it. Fenwick had complained of nothing unusual the evening before, had eaten his modest ration and settled into his tent alongside 3 other soldiers exactly as he had every other night this campaign. Sometime in those dark, cold hours, his body simply stopped, gently enough that none of his tent mates, sleeping close beside him, noticed anything wrong until morning light revealed what the darkness had concealed. The young soldier had known Fenwick only slightly, had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him across the entire campaign, brief pleasantries about weather or rations shared in passing near the cooking fires. And yet the news settles over him with a weight he finds difficult to fully name, something beyond simple sympathy for a man he barely knew, closer perhaps to a quiet recognition of how easily this particular ending might have claimed someone he knew far better. This is Winter's particular, patient cruelty he understands now more clearly than any previous lesson this campaign has offered. It does not announce itself with the drama of battle, does not give a man the chance to see danger coming and brace against it. It simply accumulates, quietly, night after night, wearing down whatever reserves a body carries until eventually, for some men, there is simply nothing left to draw upon. Fenwick's ending came not through any single dramatic failure but through the slow, cumulative toll of weeks spent fighting a cold that never fully relented, weeks of insufficient food and interrupted rest finally exceeding what his body, older and perhaps more depleted than anyone realized, could continue sustaining. Osric, when the young soldier finds him later that morning near the modest fire where several soldiers have gathered in the particular subdued quiet that follows news like this, offers little in the way of easy comfort, though his presence itself seems to steady something in the young soldier's chest. This happens, he says simply, every winter campaign he's known, though rarely enough that it never stops carrying weight when it does. Not every soldier lost to winter falls to enemy action or dramatic misfortune. Some simply reach the end of what their bodies can endure, quietly, without any single moment anyone could point to and say, "Here, this was preventable, this was someone's failure." The camp holds a brief, simple ceremony that afternoon, nothing elaborate, just words spoken over frozen ground too hard to properly dig, a small cairn of stones raised instead to mark where Fenwick will rest until warmer ground allows for something more permanent. The young soldier stands among the gathered soldiers, watching frost-dried breath rise from dozens of bowed heads, thinking about how thoroughly this campaign has reshaped his understanding of danger, of courage, of what survival actually demands from men asked to endure conditions never designed for human bodies to withstand indefinitely. That evening, settling into his own tent, he finds himself checking his tent mates more carefully than usual before sleep claims him. Listening for the particular rhythm of their breathing, reassured somehow by its steady, ordinary presence. He thinks of Fenwick, of the quiet, undramatic nature of his ending, and understands, with a clarity that feels almost like grief though he barely knew the man, exactly why the older soldiers move through this camp with such careful, constant vigilance toward each other. Winter asks nothing dramatic of the men it eventually claims. It simply waits, patient and quiet, for whatever moment a body finally has nothing left to give. The days that follow Fenwick's death settle into something the young soldier has come to recognize as this campaign's particular rhythm, grief folded quietly into routine, the ordinary business of survival continuing because it must, because a camp cannot afford to stop and properly mourn every loss when the cold itself grants no pause for such things. Fenwick's tent mates take on new bunking arrangements within a day, the small, practical adjustments of camp life absorbing his absence the way frozen ground eventually absorbs even the deepest footprint. Slowly, but completely, there is talk now, though, spreading through the camp with a different quality than the anxious rumors that once circulated about delayed supply wagons or uncertain commander decisions. This talk carries something closer to hope, tentative and carefully unspoken in its fullest form, as though naming it too directly might somehow curse its arrival. Scouts have returned with word that the worst of the season may finally be loosening its grip, that supply lines further south have stabilized, that reinforcements and proper resupply might reach this camp within a fortnight if conditions hold. The young soldier finds himself listening for these rumors now with an attentiveness he hadn't allowed himself earlier in the campaign, when hope itself had felt like a luxury too dangerous to indulge, too likely to be disappointed by whatever fresh hardship winter still had in reserve. But something has shifted in recent days, subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable. The bitter edge has softened slightly from the coldest hours. The snow falling now carries a different weight than the dry, brutal powder of deep winter, and once, just once, he thought he caught the faint, unmistakable scent of thawing earth beneath the snow during his morning rounds, though he said nothing of it to anyone, unwilling to trust his own hopeful imagination too readily. Osric, ever measured in his optimism, cautions against reading too much into these small signs when the young soldier mentions them during a quiet evening near the fire. He has seen false springs before, brief thaws that lull a camp into premature relief before winter reasserts itself with renewed fury, catching soldiers unprepared precisely because they'd allowed themselves to believe the worst had already passed. Better to keep every careful habit intact, he advises, the layered wool, the rationed fires, the nightly checking of feet and hands, until the thaw proves itself lasting rather than simply teasing false hope before winter's final, cruelest turn. Still, even Osric cannot fully suppress something lighter in his own demeanor these past few days. A slight easing in the perpetual watchfulness that has defined his bearing since the campaign's earliest, harshest weeks. The captain, too, moves through camp with a bearing the young soldier hasn't seen since before the supply wagons first failed to arrive, something almost like cautious confidence returning to conversations that had grown steadily more clipped and worried as the season wore on. The wood-gathering parties, still diligent, still careful, notice the shift most concretely of all. Branches that would have snapped clean and dry in deep winter now show faint traces of moisture beneath their bark, evidence the ground itself has begun, however slowly, however tentatively. Its long transition away from the killing frost that has defined every day of this campaign since it began. The horses, too, seem to sense something shifting, standing perhaps slightly less huddled together during the milder afternoons, though they remain, wisely, unwilling to abandon their careful winter arrangements entirely. Watt's ankle, healing slowly but steadily now, allows him his first tentative walk beyond his tent in nearly 2 weeks, a small, ordinary triumph that the young soldier witnesses with quiet satisfaction, watching his friend move carefully across camp with the particular pride of a man reclaiming something winter had briefly taken from him. Godric, fully recovered from his fever, has regained the easy conversation and small humor that had gone quiet during his illness, teasing the young soldier now about his own frozen beard with the familiar warmth of their earlier friendship restored, that evening, settling into his tent with the particular exhausted satisfaction of another day survived. The young soldier allows himself, finally, a small measure of the hope he's been guarding so carefully these past weeks. Spring remains distant still, uncertain in its exact arrival, and Osric's warnings about false thaws linger sensibly in his mind. But something has shifted in this valley, in this camp, in the quiet, patient endurance of men who have weathered a season that claimed pieces of some and tested every reserve of those who remained. Whatever difficulties still wait between here and spring's true arrival, the worst, perhaps, finally, has begun its slow retreat. There comes an evening, some days later, when the young soldier steps outside his tent and notices something that stops him entirely still for a long moment. The sky, clear for once after so many nights of snow and heavy cloud, holds a color he hasn't seen in what feels like months, a soft, deepening blue rather than the flat, oppressive gray that has defined nearly every evening since this campaign began. Stars emerge gradually as the light fades, and for the first time in longer than he can quite remember, the cold settling over the camp carries something almost gentle in it, sharp still, but no longer carrying that particular deadly edge that once made every night feel like a quiet negotiation with survival itself. He stands there a while, simply watching, letting the accumulated weight of this long winter settle differently over him than it has on so many previous nights. Behind him, the camp continues its familiar evening rhythms, low conversation drifting from nearby tents, The modest crackle of fires no longer rationed quite so severely now that supply lines have finally, properly reopened. The occasional soft laugh that would have felt almost foreign weeks earlier, when exhaustion and cold had worn away so much of the easy warmth soldiers once carried between each other. Osric finds him there, settling quietly beside him with the particular comfortable silence that has grown between them over these difficult weeks. Neither feels compelled to fill the quiet with unnecessary words, content simply to stand together beneath a sky finally clear enough to properly hold stars, watching breath rise pale and thin into air that no longer bites quite so viciously as it once did. The young soldier thinks, standing there, of everything this winter has asked of him and taught him in equal, tangled measure. He thinks of Fenwick, gone quietly in the dark, and of Watt's ankle, healed now enough to carry him steadily across camp again. He thinks of Corbin, recovered fully from that frightening collapsed watch, and of Godric's fever finally broken, and of the thin woman in that small village whose hospitality none of them had truly earned yet received regardless. He thinks of horses standing flank to flank against wind, and sentries counting breaths to measure lonely hours, and small fires kept deliberately, carefully dim against dangers that never quite arrived, though their possibility shaped every night regardless. None of it, he understands now, standing here beneath this finally gentle sky, felt like the war stories he'd once imagined before this campaign began. No dramatic battles decided in a single afternoon, no clear moments of glory worth singing about around some future fire. Just this, months of quiet, patient endurance, small kindnesses exchanged in the dark, careful vigilance maintained not through dramatic courage but through the steady, unglamorous commitment of ordinary men determined simply to see each other through to morning, night after night after night. Osric speaks eventually, his voice carrying the particular weathered warmth of a man who has crossed this same threshold between winter's grip and spring's slow arrival more times than he probably cares to count. "It gets easier from here," he says simply, though not without a certain rueful acknowledgment in his tone, understanding perhaps better than the young soldier yet does exactly what other challenges still wait beyond this particular ending. Whatever campaign spring might eventually demand once true warmth finally returns to stay. The young soldier nods slowly, accepting this simple wisdom the way he's learned to accept so much this winter, without needing every uncertainty fully resolved before finding some measure of peace in the present moment regardless. Tomorrow will bring whatever tomorrow brings, further marching perhaps, further hardship in whatever form the coming season chooses to offer. But tonight, at least, the sky holds stars rather than snow, and the air, however still sharp with cold, no longer carries that deadly patience it held through the campaign's harshest weeks. He turns finally toward his tent, toward sleep that comes easier now than it has in longer than he cares to measure, and pauses once more at the entrance. Looking back briefly at the camp spread quietly behind him, fires burning steady rather than desperately rationed, soldiers moving with the loosened bearing of men who have, somehow, together, survived what winter demanded of them. Whatever waits beyond tonight, whatever the spring campaigns ahead might eventually reveal, this particular test, this long season of cold and quiet endurance, has finally, gently, begun releasing its hold. He ducks inside his tent, settles into the familiar arrangement of cloaks that has kept him alive through so many difficult nights, and closes his eyes, letting sleep come easily now, carried by a stillness that finally, after so long, feels less like survival and more like simple, ordinary rest.